a dear friend of my parents, and just thrilled to have him here today. And I don't think he needs a whole lot more explanation of who he is. So, Mayor Jeff Schielke, thank you.
Well, here I am again. And what I'm going to do today, and if some of you, many of you in this room have been here for most of my programs, I guess what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you an update on some of the things I previously talked about, because some very interesting things have happened since last we were here and last we met. So you're going to see something come on and say, well, he's already talked about that. Well, I have new information about it. So I thought this would be a good time to kind of catch up on stuff. There is a TV show on WGN on Sunday nights at 10:30 after the news called The Backstory. And it's a story of various things that have happened in Chicago's history, and reporter Larry Potash goes out and does research on what is now taking place. And I'm told by some of those folks that I know in that industry in there that really is one of the more popular programs that many, many people in the region watch. I'm surprised WGN doesn't move it to a more prominent time than 10:30 at night, but that's when it's on, so that's where. So I've tried to kind of emulate what they do there and base it on Batavia experiences. So we've got some interesting stuff to talk about, and there's some interesting things that I'm going to share with you that may pop up in the future about the name Batavia and some of the people who have lived here, because over the past couple of years, I have been contacted several times by the movie industry who is working on scripts of things that potentially could have a Batavia sidebar to them or whatever have you. And they're researching people and whatever, and I'll get into that in a minute. So why don't we start? All right, the first thing I wanted to do is show you this list of officials. This is the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning's MPO board, or Metropolitan Planning Board, and this is the group of folks that sit in Chicago at the old post office building, and they come in for meetings. Most of them don't work directly there. It's headed by the Illinois State Transportation Secretary, whoever he or she may be at any given time. And this is the group that gets handed all the federal money for distribution and makes the decisions as to where the money is going to get spent. And there used to be a thing where the city of Chicago got more than its fair share. But then it was pointed out to them that of the region, there's about 9.5 million people, and there's only 3 million less now living in the city, and 650,000, or 6,500,000 are living in the 284 suburbs. So the suburbs have a representative on this board, the chairman of the mayor of the CMAP Board of Directors. And that name here is in the last aisle, the fourth one from the bottom, and it's myself. And so I've been on this board now a number of years, and I've had some very interesting experiences. We got a number of years back, Barack Obama got elected president of the United States, and one of the first things he did was come in and drop $470 million on the city of Chicago to rebuild the Circle Interchange, because that was a very badly run thing. It had been altered and changed, and a lot of stuff had happened. And so he got this money. Well, they had to go to the board and have the board accept the money. So I got asked to make the motion to accept the money because they wanted the suburban guy to do this. And so I said, well, so I talked to my vice chairman, who's the mayor up in East Chicago Heights, and he says, yeah, let's go ahead and grab it. He says that, it makes it all stand good. So I went ahead and made the motion. So now they've rebuilt it. And so every time I drive through it, I think to myself, well, I made the motion to do this. So anyway, I'm going to talk about a couple of things with this board later on in my talk here that have come up that I think you'll find of interest. So let's go to the first slide. Okay, this is a picture taken and I was 5 years old, so this was 70 years ago this picture was taken. And this is a picture of former Fire Chief Bud Richter and his Dalmatian dog, who was quite famous. His name was Streamer. And I was a 5-year-old kid, and I was very interested in the fire department. I still am, but my dad took me down and Richter was there, so he says, well, let's go pose Jeff with the dog. So we went out and took this particular picture. Well, shortly after this picture got taken, let's go to the next thing. Jack and Jill magazine, which was a very, very popular magazine for children in the 1950s, in the June of 1955 edition, the lead story in this magazine, which I'm told had about 30,000 subscribers nationwide at the time, on a monthly basis, people subscribed for their children for the stories. The lead story was entitled Sparky the Fire Dog, and it was written by a Batavia resident by the name of Peg Tyndall Jackson, who lived out on Deer Path Road. Now, as they said at the fire department, Peg Tyndall Jackson took a lot of liberties in the life of the Dalmatian dog at the fire department, including changing for the story its name from Streamer to Sparky. And then she made up a few things about what Sparky did and didn't do. But at the end of the day, the story was very widely read and approved. And so it began, let's go to the next picture. Okay, this is what the actual picture looked like. They brought in an artist and they pulled the fire trucks out of the station and they sketched pictures. This is a picture of our first ladder truck in Batavia history. But anyway, then they had the Batavia Fire Station, only one bay, and at the time it was 3, but you know, they were making it sound like small town America. And so that was a couple of things people noticed when they saw the article. Let's go to the next picture. This is the obituary of Peg Tyndall Jackson. She died in May of 1996, but she had authored a number of stories. She was a writer. She had a daughter that went to the then Batavia High School, which was on this site. And I know, looking over the crowd today, there's several people in this room that went to school with her. So there's people out here that will certainly remember her. Let's go to the next picture. Okay, this is in the story. She talks about Sparky, it was really Streamer, jumping on the fire truck, and we went over to West Chicago to a fire in the roundhouse at the railroad yard. And as was always the case, once the dog got there, the dog didn't stay at the fire. He started roaming around the neighborhood to see if he could find things to eat, or a female dog that was tied up that he could pay a visit on, and whatever have you. But this is the picture taken at that particular fire of Chief Richter with the dog standing next to him. And this was always kind of a joke in the Batavia Fire Department, that she's right and the dog left, and they ended up leaving him in West Chicago and coming back to Batavia, and then the dog found his way home. That wasn't the truth, but Richter always had this picture to kind of defend the dog because it was. So let's go to the next picture. This is where the real story is. This was a picture that Richter had, I think it was Glenn Haynes, who was then the community photographer. He had Glenn Haynes come down to the fire station about 3 weeks after this thing was published in Jack and Jill magazine, because suddenly the Batavia Fire Department was getting visitors from all over the Midwest, bringing their small children in and wanting to have their picture taken with the dog at the Batavia Fire Station. And so he figured out where was the best place to have the dog's picture taken. And then what you did was the fireman, you knock on open the little door that was inside the door of the station, and you go in there, and the guys knew why you were coming, and so they'd open the door up, and then they'd have to give Streamer a treat. And they had a whole bowl of treats there. And when they went to the bowl, Streamer knew he had to go out front and sit on the sidewalk to get his treat. And so then you'd bring your kids in and you'd take a picture of the kids with the dog. That's what went on. And allegedly, Richter told me that he thought it was probably no less than over 500 times in over the next 3 or 4 months after the publication that people showed up at the Batavia Fire Station wanting to have the picture taken with Streamer. So that's one of the Batavia stories. But the backstory to this is that I'm pleased to announce today, and I just confirmed this again with those involved, that the City of Batavia Police Department is about to take on a friendly dog, I'll call it. And he's going to be riding in the car with one of the officers, and you'll see him. And they're going to go into the school, and the police are going to introduce him to all the kids in the school and talk about police issues and whatever. And then they're going to be available to take it to service clubs and, you know, whoever wants to see the dog, and then they'll explain it. And in a real emergency, the dog, well, this dog will not be an attack dog. He won't go biting anybody or whatever have you, but he may have the talent to smell things. So if there's something we need to chase the smell to, he can do that. The dog, I guess the chief told me this morning, he's kind of on order. They get special dogs with special talents and abilities, and he couldn't tell me what Dalmatian, what part of the dog world the dog was going to come from, but we hope to have him here in about the beginning of the summer. And then he'll be with us every day for the rest of his life. And we've got a special little area in the police station set up now for the dog to go into a nice warm area where he can be fed and whatever. And there's going to be one officer assigned to him that'll be on regular patrol, but he'll also be available to take the dog to all these places. So we really haven't had any real dogs since the fire department had Streamer. Streamer ended up living, I think, 12 years before he finally passed away. He was very old for a dog's age when he passed away. But we do have the dog returning, so that's the backstory on this story. Is we've never had dogs till now we're getting one back. So I'm thinking that's very interesting. So let's go to the next story. Okay, this is a picture, a record album picture of Jackie DeShannon. And as some of the old timers in this room will remember, and there's a few of you, I'll look around here, that I know were probably in Batavia High School with her at this location. She came to Batavia High School and she stayed 2 years. She was in her freshman and her sophomore year, and at the end of her sophomore year she quit because she was going on to this singing career. And she lived out at 713 East Wilson Street and at 69 South Mallory at the corner of Mallory and First Street. And she was readily available to go sing anytime she got the thing, but she started writing her own songs. So in writing her own songs, she wrote the songs, Put a Little Love in Your Heart, and What the World Needs Now is Love. And so in 1987, she won the Grammy Award for the best, creating the best music of the year. But one of her real interesting claims to fame was in 1964, she got hired by those involved to be the opening act for the Beatles' first tour of America when they came over from England for the first time. And they went into 19 towns across America and had huge concerts. And many of you remember that's when all the girls screamed and fainted, and it was quite the conversation. They had them on Ed Sullivan's show and whatever. But when they had the actual concerts, Jackie would go out and kind of warm the crowd up and sing a couple songs and whatever have you, and clap her hands and whatever. And that's kind of what it was all about. So about maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, I get a call one day from Hollywood, and it's the movie industry. And they said, we'd like to know some background on Jackie DeShannon, because right now we are negotiating to make a movie of the Beatles' first tour of America in 1964. And she was the opening act, and so a lot of this is going to be hopefully the music of the Beatles sang that day. So we'd like to have some background about her, just know a little bit about her. And they said, there's maybe a subplot in this movie that's going to be that during the tour that they made through the 19 towns, it took, I believe, about 3 weeks, that she got a little romantic thing going with John Lennon. And the other 3 boys in the band got their noses out of joint. And so they think that this could be a good subplot in the movie, that how they divided this up and what was happening with that. So that was kind of going to be, other than the boys singing and going to Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, whatever, they were going to put in this little Jackie DeShannon story about her and John Lennon. Well, then about, maybe 6 months later, I got a call back from the gal that was trying to put all this together. Oh, she said to me, can you give me any stories of any romantic things that Jackie did when she was at Batavia High School? So there is a group that meets at McDonald's most mornings of a bunch of guys from that era. And so a couple of them are sitting here in the audience right now. And so I went down there one day and told them what I had been approached with by the movie industry. And they said, well, the only one we know that ever got a kiss from her was Bob Becker. And Bob Becker's grandmother lived right next door to her on East Wilson Street. And there was a time that Bob was up painting his grandmother's window frames, and he was sitting on the roof, and he had the ladder up, and Jackie DeShannon ran up and sat on the roof with him. And so his grandmother came out and gave them both a sandwich. And when she got ready to leave, Jackie DeShannon gave Bob Becker a kiss for his grandmother's sandwich. So I don't think that's what Hollywood was looking for. But that was the story as it presented itself. So I called her back and told her that. So then she called me back and she says, well, we've had to put the whole movie idea on hold because when the Beatles broke up, to kind of cash themselves out, they put all their songs on the market. And there was a big bidding war to see who's going to get the Beatles songs. And the people that bought them, some of them now want multi-millions of dollars in licensing rights to have these songs done. So we're going to have to sit on this for a while and see if it calms down. But that movie may still be made someday, but that's a movie involving obviously the Batavia Girl. And as I say, Jackie DeShannon did win the Grammy Award in 1987, so out on East Wilson Street at 713, we got the home of the girl that won the Grammy Award. And in this picture next to her is the picture of her, I believe, her sophomore class homeroom with Jerry Linton as the homeroom teacher. And some of you, maybe somebody in here may be in this picture because it's in the Batavia High School yearbook, of which our library has assembled a complete set and is down there in the Batavia room. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, this is the story of Mr. William J. Wood. And the two ladies standing behind Mr. Wood in this picture are my two secretaries, great secretaries that were with me for 20 to 30 years each, and they many times worked together. And Mr. Wood retired, and then he became the town historian, and there was a bunch of questions that the city had about different things that had happened in utilities and whatever have you, and most of this could be found in the old Batavia Herald newspapers, of which we had quite a few up on the third floor. So many days Mr. Wood would come to my office, take his coat off, and then the girls would take him up on the third floor, and he'd dig into the city documents and he'd discover what was what, wherever it was, and whatever have you. So these were his favorite people. These girls and him really had a nice relationship. And at the end of the day, when he was really starting to kind of go downhill, he set up a call reporting system with Susie Petkus and Jeanette Arbors. He would call my office about 9:30 in the morning and let them know he had gotten up. And then they were supposed to tell me about it, or if they didn't tell me, I was supposed to go up to the house and see if he was sick or what had happened to him. So we had that system running. That's one of the many services the city of Batavia's provided. So anyway, I show this picture because there's a very interesting Batavia story on this. In this picture, you can't see it real well, but Bill always wore something around his neck. And when he was the principal at J.B. Nelson School, he always wore a whistle. But the thing he loved to wear around his neck were religious crosses. He was a very devout member of the Catholic Church. He was the organist there for 30 years. And he always wore these religious crosses around his neck. So in 1957 and 58, I believe it was, Bill took a leave of absence from his job as principal at J.B. Nelson School for 2 years, and he went to Japan. And he toured Japan because he got to be the principal of the U.S. Air Force Base in Japan. He was the principal of the school there for 2 years. So we got to travel around, and sometimes the Air Force would fly him to the other end of the country and he'd explore that for a few days, and he had all kinds of great experiences. When he finally came back from Japan, he had taken a lot of pictures, and I ended up being the executor of his estate, and he had a lot of stuff in his house. It took me several years to get the house cleaned out. And among the things he had in one of his closets, the closet was almost full, was of colored slides. And there were literally thousands upon thousands of color slides of Japan. Now, and intermixed in the slides were some Batavia shots and pictures of J.B. Nelson school kids and whatever. So I had to sit on his front steps for several years and slide by slide hold them up to the sky and see which was Batavia and which was someplace else, mostly Japan. And the Japan ones, I had no other thing to do but throw them away because there wasn't anybody in town that knew anybody or anything else. We saved all the Batavia ones, and the Depot Museum got them out of those, so his collection about Batavia was preserved. But he had all these slides, and so he also had these religious crosses. So when he died, he left me instructions that he had 178 religious crosses. And he had a list of names, people that he knew all over the world, that he wanted me to either send or distribute these crosses to. And so I believe I ended up sending or giving out over 80 of them to different people, but there still was quite a pile of them there. So, as things worked out, let's go to the next picture. In Batavia, we have a couple that live here over on Republic Road. I'm going to not name names, I don't want to get anybody embarrassed or anything. But we have a girl whose husband, or a guy whose sister is, the girl that lives in Batavia, her brother married this girl by the name of Terry Mewson, who is the co-host with the Robertson family on the 700 Club every morning. And so a few years back, the mother of the family from Batavia had a 90th birthday party for their mother, and Terry Mewson and her husband, who was another son of the lady, they came to Batavia for the birthday party. So I was told they were coming. I know this family very well. And so I put about 35 of the unused crosses in a little box, and I took them over to the birthday party and walked in, and everybody knew me, and I proceeded to announce I had this gift for Terry to give her, and I gave Terry Mewson 35 of Bill Wood's crosses. So right away she's really excited and pleased, and her husband was also very pleased that this is happening. So then she wrote down some information about where these crosses came from, and she says, I hope you don't mind if I tell about this on the club on nationwide TV. And I said, oh, no, certainly no problem as far as I'm concerned. So as recently as about 2 weeks ago, I was up at the homestead, up in the lobby, and these three, I think they were newly arrived residents of the homestead, ladies, came up to me and they said, can you tell us about this Bill Wood guy? We see his crosses with Terry Mewson all the time on the 700 Club, and he's from Batavia. What was this guy's role in town? So Bill's now gotten nationwide TV publicity because of Terry Mewson's showing off his crosses on TV. So I think that's just a very interesting beginning story about Bill. So let's go to one now about a book. So when Bill went to Japan, he really got into it, and he learned how to do the Japanese tea ceremony. And then he got himself outfitted in these big colorful robes that he put on, and he would get into go before women's clubs and church groups and Rotary clubs and all kinds of, I don't know how many scores of presentations he did, but he gave this tea ceremony, and as part of the tea ceremony he had to make this Japanese tea. So he had brought some with him of some size, but he did so many of them that he started running out of Japanese tea. So he nosed around, and this is again before the computer, and he found that there was up on the north side of Chicago, I believe near Peterson and Pulaski, there was a Japanese general store, and that they had Japanese products that they sold in the store. So one day he and Eldora Hoover went up to this store, and they walked in, and there was this lady there, and he proceeds to tell him what he wants to do, and as he said, one thing led to another, and 3 hours later they were still standing there talking to this woman about Japan and this tea and everything else. So Bill says to her, we're having such a nice time in conversation, could we take you out to dinner? And she says, well, I'd be honored to go, but before I go, I need to tell you one thing about myself. I spent 5.5 years in the federal penitentiary, and that was because they called me Tokyo Rose. And I was put in jail and whatever, and she says, and now I've got a pending exoneration from no less than the President of the United States waiting for me, but it hasn't happened yet. So Bill and Eldora took her to lunch or dinner, and then that became an ongoing, very serious friendship between them. And there was at least once that she went down to the Northwestern Station in downtown Chicago early one morning, got on the train, came out to Geneva. Bill went to Geneva and picked her up and took her over to J.B. Nelson School, and then he walked her. She sat every classroom in J.B. for about a half hour. She watched the kids because she wanted to watch Teaching in Progress. And so she spent a whole day at J.B. Nelson School watching the kids. And nobody, of course, nobody knew who she was or anything, but she was there. So Bill and her became very good friends, and so lo and behold, this girl arrives from California one day and says, I'd like to write a book about your life story. And so Tokyo Rose thought about it for a while, and then she called Bill. And she said, I got this girl that wants to write my life story, and I think I'm going to let her do it, but it's going to be with the condition that she writes my life story one chapter at a time. And when the chapter is done, she sends it to me and doesn't write anything more till I give it to you, Bill Wood, and you read it and tell me if you think historically there's any inaccuracies or she's saying something about me she shouldn't say or whatever have you. Well, this went on for I think about 1.5 years. And Bill Wood told me later, he said, that was one of the best written books I've ever seen. I couldn't find one error in it in any way, shape, or form. And so the girl ended up publishing this book. It's called Tokyo Rose. And I don't know if we got a copy here in the library or not, but anyway, I'm sure you can go online and order it from some of the other libraries if you're interested in it. But Bill Wood doesn't get mentioned. That was part of the deal, that he was never brought into the picture. But he wrote this book. Well, then people came along. Bill, this is like now 2005, 2006. Bill died in 2005, and I think Tokyo Rose died maybe within a year or so. So the next thing I know, one day I get a call from the office of Bill Curtis, the former TV guy, and he's making a biography of her that he's selling on TV. And he says, I've been told by people in the background in Chicago that the guy I really need to have in this show is Bill Wood. I said, well, I'm afraid you're too late. He died last year, so he's not in the show. So he says, well, I'm not so sure that this movie, or this book, plus my biographical movie, I got some film we're going to show. He says, it wouldn't surprise me that this thing ends up being a movie, that somebody will want to make this into a movie. Now that hasn't happened yet. I haven't gotten that call from somebody wanting to know where they can find Bill Wood from the movie industry, but it may very well be out there someplace. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, this is where we really get in deep. This is the book, The Devil at the White City, and this is the story of this Dr. Holmes, who was somehow on the staff with us, and I guess he gave physicals and treated people from the staff that were sick. And at the end of the day, he started entertaining good-looking girls, and before it was over with, he killed 13 or 15 of them, and he was a blatant murderer. And so there's been this book written now by Eric Larson, who lives out in Seattle. And he came into Chicago and spent almost a year or so, I'm told, just researching and going into all the records and whatever have you. Well, one of the things that they found as they delved deep into the records of this Devil at the White City is that in the very early days of the girls starting to get murdered, there was this guy from Batavia, Illinois, that came in and began asking a lot of questions, because his second cousin, as it ended up, was the first victim of Dr. Holmes and his murder. And that person was none other than Dr. Bernard Segran. And Segran went in there late 1800s, and his second cousin Emily had lived down in Dwight, Illinois. And apparently she was a very good-looking girl, and she went in there and somehow got hired by this Dr. Holmes to be his assistant. And then they announced they were getting married, and it's not clear if they ever did get married, but then suddenly Emily disappeared, and Holmes' story was she left him for somebody else or something. But Segran wasn't sure of that. So then all these other girls started disappearing. And so now the world is more interested in probably Dr. Segran from a murder perspective than any other. So in the last year or so now, I've gotten the calls at the City Hall from, well, the people, they're now making a movie of the Devil at the White City that I think will be out here in the next year some point in time. And it's going to be based on the book. But I got a call about 6-8 weeks ago from another lady who's working on a TV series, that they're going to let the movie come out and be seen, and then they're going to have a TV series about each victim that was in here and leading up to the victim, because they say there's a lot more to this story than you can probably put out in a 2.5-hour movie, and so they're working on this. So when they're chit-chatting with me about this thing, make sure I got my slides right here. Todd, slip to the next picture. Okay, this is Reverend Faye Arnold Moon, who was the minister of the United Methodist Church across the street here. And he was here from 1915 to 1918. And now that's, you know, this Holmes guy was in Chicago in 1895, so we're about 20 years apart. But the Moon and his wife, Reverend Moon and his wife, had a daughter, Marion. Let's go to the next picture. And this is a picture of the Batavia 8th grade class in 1915 that went to this building. And there's two people in this picture that have red circles around their head. And the one at the back is Marion Moon, the daughter of Reverend Moon. And the one in the front is, I can't remember, what's the first name of Dr. Segran's? Beth Segran. And they were in the same class together. So Hollywood calls me up looking for information about the Segrans. So I say, well, we got this picture in Batavia of his daughter in the same class with the mother of the guy that put the American flag on the moon. Oh boy, they went sky high on that one. They were trying to, I said, well, you better wait before you get too excited here, because this is about 20 years apart between, you know, Reverend Moon being here and when Segran was pushing the American flag. And so then they say, well, yeah, but the American flag didn't really get American Flag Day was approved in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson, and so we can maybe bring that into this whole thing that there was this earlier relationship. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but I just wanted to share with you that Hollywood's looking at this and trying to figure out. And Segran's now, I've gotten maybe 2 or 3 other inquiries from people doing doctorate degree researches and whatever have you, and it all wants to go back to, they've read the Segran name in Devil at the White City and what was it. And I'm led to believe that there may be some Chicago police reports that are very, very old that were written in which the police are suggesting that they needed to have some autopsies done on some of these girls, because some of them, one of the things Holmes did was cut their bodies up and ship them out to some friend of his who was running a school for mortuary science and inquests and whatever have you, and he was selling these body parts. So it's got some strange different twist to it, but that's kind of where this whole thing kind of ends up. So the reason I showed you the first slide with me being on the Suburban Voice on the Chicago Public Transportation Committee, Policy Committee, is the fact that as Chicago now is doing things, they have decided that they are, with Barack Obama wanting to build his library in the city, and so we were told Barack came in and said he had made the decision. He wanted that library built in his old neighborhood where he grew up, because he wanted the kids in the neighborhood to see what he was able to accomplish growing up in that neighborhood. He wanted that to be the message. So the neighborhood is right at 55th Street there, right behind this Museum of Science and Industry in Jackson Park, which I guess was what was created after the White City left. And so there's now this interest in, well, gee, we can have a Barack Obama's museum, and then we can have White City with all the stories that are being written about. Of course, some of that is not too good, but I mean, it's all part of a grander Chicago history. So I have nothing to say or do with what the city of Chicago is doing, but I know they're doing some stuff, because they came to the committee that I'm on and they asked for an $8 million, and I made the motion, as they generally want me to do, that they got $8 million to go into Lakeshore Drive and create 2 side streets that would come off of Lakeshore Drive and go into this area where Jackson Park and Barack Obama's museum is. And I've had one of the Chicago people tell me that one of the things they are now doing is studying how the midway at the White City looked, and they're trying to maybe think about having an artist paint very large portraits, and they will put those up so people will be able to come in, walk through what will be a picture of the midway on both sides of them, up front of it and whatever have you, and they'll be able to get an idea of what the White City was all about. Because beyond this terrible murder thing, the White City was quite the place for Burnham, who was then the architect in designing early Chicago, that many of his works were put in there. And so it would give them an idea to pay tribute to Burnham. And I don't know if they're even going to mention so much about the White City, but that's what a lot of people will probably want to go in there and see, as to what this whole thing looked like. So that's kind of another one of the ideas that's out there unfolding in the publication world as to what can be done, and that may be another 5-10 years away before the Chicago gets all this done. I've seen the road plans for the new cut entrances off of, I don't think we call it Lakeshore Drive anymore, it has another name to it. Should have written that. What? DuSable, yeah, DuSable Boulevard. They're getting it ready to put that in, and so we'll see where that all goes. But as they say, they've got some pretty interesting tourist attractions if they put this White City thing up and then have Barack Obama's museum right next to it, and then the Museum of Science and Industry right in front of it. That'll be a big place for people to go. And the city told me that recently that they're pleased by what's happening, because there wasn't a lot of businesses down in this area. There were some, and then most of them left because it was kind of not nice things happening in the neighborhood. But now they've got, I believe, McDonald's and Walgreens and a couple others are willing to build new stores right in this area where all this will be and all these tourists will be coming. So that just kind of shows you how things get. But I just wanted to bring that in from Batavia's perspective, because Segran seems to be playing such a significant role in this thing that you may be hearing more about him and his family in the days ahead with this connection to the White City issues. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this is another one that I have talked about previously. This is a book called Watch Your Step, and it was written by William Van Noordtreek. And basically, William Van Noordtreek was the descendant of the Van Noordtreek family. We have a street named after him over here on the west side. And Van Noordtreek was noted because he was an expert in art. He had gone to Princeton University and gotten a degree in art history. And so when World War II started, he was drafted into the Army, and he ended up being assigned to this thing called the Monuments Men. Now, there's just been a movie made about the Monuments Men. I went and saw it, and as near as I can tell, in the movie they changed everybody who was in the unit's name. So Van Noordtrecht didn't get mentioned, or I don't know if any of the other people got mentioned, but they totally, and I can just this is a picture of William Van Noordtrecht and I standing in front of the family's building, which is now our city hall. And I can just imagine what William Van Noordtrecht would have had to say about that movie with this not being named. Because what his job was is we invaded to reclaim Europe, France and Germany. He sat back someplace and with books, he researched all the towns we were about to go in and identified if there was a piece of notable art within it. And then it was passed on to the Army officers who were going in on the thing to get into this town and go to this church or this building, and don't damage this building too much because this is a significant part of the art of the history of the world. So that's what he did, and then he supposedly followed right behind the actual invasion and got in and saved a lot of the art. And in the movie there's one guy that is portrayed as a German officer, and he's in the Louvre in Paris, France, and he's in there, and there was some woman that was kind of the curator of it. He wasn't very, in the movie, he's not very nice to her. And he ends up taking a bunch of the art out of the Louvre and loading it onto a train and is taking it out of Paris. And in the movie, she shows up on a bicycle and starts screaming at him. He pulls out a gun and starts to shoot at her. Now, he doesn't show that he hit her, but he fired guns at her. Now, if you read William Van Noordtrecht's book, he talks about the guy that was the German officer that was at the Louvre, and he has that guy portrayed in an entirely different fashion about how he was the guy that saved most of the art because the buildings were starting to get bombed, and he took it all out and hid it in a trench or down in someplace underground so it never got damaged, and he was the real hero. But in the movie, he's portrayed as the real villain. So I don't know what to make of it, but that here again, that's Batavia's connection with the movie world. So we just never stopped to have it. Van Noordtrecht had the idea in his head that he lived in New York City at 55th Street and the street that overlooks the East River.
Sutton Place.
What?
Sutton Place.
Sutton Place, yeah, 55th and Sutton. And he ended up having quite an apartment full of art of his own. And so one day I was out in New York and I had my dad with, and he invited us to come to his apartment for dinner. So we went over and had dinner, and he had his quote-unquote architect and his lawyer there at us. And he wanted me to meet those folks because his grand plan was, in his will, he was going to leave all this money to the city of Batavia to take the third floor of what today is our city hall, and now it's a performing little theater group up there. But he was going to have it all professionally trimmed out as a museum, and he was going to display all this treasured art that he had acquired over the years. So that's fine. So a couple years later, one day I get the call that he had died. And so they said, we're going to start packing up this stuff and start shipping it to Batavia. So about a day or two later, my secretaries call me and say there's a process server out in the front lobby and he wants to serve you with a subpoena. So I go out there, and it was one of the Kane County guys, and he had a subpoena from the New York City district attorney, or whatever you call him out there. And it was informing me that the entire Van Noordtrecht estate that was in his will that included this large share of money for Batavia had been contested, and it was going to have to be tried in a court of law by his wife. Now, he supposedly had married a girl right after World War II, and in his will he says, I'm removing her from any receiving anything in this will because she abandoned me. And that's, everybody knows it, so why bother with her? So I'm not giving her nothing. Well, he never divorced her. And that was on which she hung. And at the end of the day, we got noted, Jim Hansen was then the president of the Historical Society. We got noticed in the mail that this was going to be a trial on this and this day, and if we wanted to come, we didn't know, you know. And at the end of the day, they called us and said, well, the courts decided that his wife is entitled to 70% of the total value of his estate, and everything he has is going to have to be taken over to the Sotheby's to be auctioned. And then they're also going to give him 5% of the estate for his her legal fees. So she got 75% of everything that Van Noordtrecht had. And then he left a nephew a couple, $10,000 or something. And so whatever was left went to the Batavia Historical Society, and I think at the end of the day, as I remember, it was around $400,000 that they got, and I think we still have it, that we were going to use to do something with the museum someplace. And so we still may have some of this money, but if you go to the Depot Museum today, there's a big portrait of him hanging there that his wife said, Dad, we send that to Batavia. That's where, get this out of my sight or something like that. So anyway, he did write this book, Watch Your Step. The book is available here in the Batavia Library, and as is Devil at the White City. So if you want to read either one of them. Then another story on the Van Noordtrechts. There was a movie made, 12 Years a Slave. Let's go to the next picture. And in this movie, there is a story of this freed black gentleman from upstate New York who has a family and everything else, and he goes to Washington, D.C., I believe it was, for some meeting, and he gets there, and he gets kidnapped by slave owners, and they take him down into Mississippi and make him a slave for 12 years. And so this is all in the movie. And so in the movie, the slave owner tells him to get in a boat and go out and start to clean up this island out in the middle of some water someplace. And so he does it, and he gets out there, and a couple of days later, the slave owner goes out on the island, and he can't believe what a job this guy's done. It's all cleaned up, everything is the way it should be. And so he says to him, boy, where did you learn how to do all this? And in the movie, the guy says, well, I worked for William Van Noordtrecht when he was building the Champlain Canal off of upstate New York. And so that's the line in the movie. So Van Noordtrecht get the credit in the movie for building that canal, which hooks onto the Erie Canal up by Albany, New York. And so I think William would have been very pleased on that one, but he didn't. All right, let's go to the next one. This is a book called American Road, and it's the story, I believe it's available here in the library, and it's the story of in 1919, a military convoy was created that go from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco and determine a route of a highway that could be built all the way across America. And so they had 62 military vehicles and 179 military men in this convoy, and they left, and they started going they left Washington, D.C. to go to San Francisco. So on July 21st, 1919, or the 20th, they stayed the night down in Chicago Heights. They were following the road of what was to be the Route 30 was the original one they were on. And they knew that it had been paved somewhat from Illinois to Washington, D.C., but when they got west of Chicagoland, it was a pretty rough road. And so they weren't even sure of the route of it, so this group was supposed to design the route. So one of the people on the venture was none other than a lieutenant colonel by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Eisenhower, later gets a lot of credit for building the interstate system, and a lot of people say that one of the things that really enticed him to build this was he had that experience of traveling across the United States and seeing the need for a highway that went places. So on the 20th, they stayed the night in Chicago Heights, and their goal was that night to stay on the west side of DeKalb, and that they would come up on Route 30 to Aurora and then come up on what today is Route 31 to Geneva, and they would turn right at South Street, which is where the Little Traveler now is, and they would go west from there out to DeKalb. So the story goes is that they got up through here and they got to Aurora, and then they came north on 31. Well, the Moose Lodge had just put Mooseheart down there about 5 years before, and they were very interested to show the kids this huge military convoy. So they took, I guess, several thousand kids that were at Mooseheart out, and they stood them along Route 31 so they could watch this. Well, then the convoy got there and they saw these kids and they explained to them what this was. So then they stopped things and they got up and they put up searchlights and did different stuff for the kids for a couple minutes. Then they decided, well, we better get going. So we've all know what this is. Right at the entrance to Mooseheart down here, you come north and there's this big hill. Now I'm told that that hill that's there today is much greatly reduced over what it was then. It was much steeper and everything else than it is today. They've leveled it out somewhat. And so they started all these army trucks up that hill. Well, almost every one of them started to overheat from the shifting of the water. And so they got up on the top of the hill by today where the Batavia Moose Lodge is. And this is like one big cloud of steam coming off of all these military vehicles. So we had a public works director by the name of Allie Perry in town. And Allie Perry heard about this, so he went down and he met up with the convoy, and they said, we need water badly. And they had taken a couple trucks and brought them up to the West Side Cemetery, which just a few weeks before they had dedicated the Newton Monument down there to Civil War veterans. So they pulled in there and there was a water trough handle that you could, probably about 1.5 inches wide, and you couldn't even begin to fill all these trucks with that amount of water. So Perry says to him, well, come up to the new high school, which is where we are right now, and out in the front, which was there, we have pictures of it, was a horse drinking trough that's hooked onto the city water system. So he says, I'll go open that trough up, and you'll have all the water you need in a real hurry to water all these trucks. So they limbered up here, and so the story goes, I was hoping someday we'd find a picture that somebody had took of this, because this was quite a scene, I guess. There was 62 military vehicles back down Batavia Avenue, and then they'd film them, and then they'd take them across the street and put them up going north out the street. So the story goes that there was the Lieutenant Colonel, Dwight D. Eisenhower, got in, kind of involved in this, and he went outside here and stood at the intersection and waved the military vehicles through, and then waved this horses and buggies and whatever else were floating around here, he waved them through. And he stood there for well over an hour as they filled all these vehicles up and got them ready, and then they filled them up and everybody left and went away. So this intersection, I'm going to close with this. This intersection has some very unique American history, because as I've already shared with you, in 1915 we had Reverend Fay Arnold Moon in here, and he ends up being the grandfather of Buzz Aldrin, who put the American flag on the moon. So then we had Dwight D. Eisenhower come and stand in the intersection here, and he later, when he became President of the United States, is credited with creating the American space industry. And then on October 25th, 1960, John F. Kennedy came through Kane County on a campaign trip 2 weeks before he was elected president, and he came down 31 and he got here, and Batavia High School had been released early, so that all the kids in the high school had come out. Ace Hapner over at McQueen had emptied his school, and the kids were standing here. And Sam Rotolo had brought all of Louise White School from the east side over here. So there was like 1,000 kids standing at this intersection. And so fortunately, and I should have put it in the program, Lee Olmsted, who unfortunately they're now retiring, but he had a new camera. So he came over here and took some really interesting photographs of John F. Kennedy stopping in the intersection here, getting on the back of his car, and he gave a speech for 1 minute and 43 seconds, and I know the time because we have a copy of the speech. But he, talked very quickly. But the interesting thing is we've got the father of the guy that put the flag on the moon. We got Dwight D. Eisenhower, who started the Space Administration. And we have John F. Kennedy, who gave the challenge to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. All three of them were within about 100 feet of each other right here at Batavia Avenue and Wilson Street. So we've just gotten a grant from the Dunham Foundation in Aurora, and we are going to create a Batavia History Sign Program. And we've got one of the first ones up here that you can see if you'd like to come up and see it when we're over. And these things will last 100 years, but we're having one of the signs made to tell the story of Kennedy and Eisenhower in this intersection. And that's going to be over on the other side of the street. And then we've got we're going to be at Bellevue, and they're going to do one, I think, at the quarry about the mining of the stone for the Great Chicago Fire. And there's a whole bunch of interesting stories. Shumway Foundry, which made the molds for the Academy Award for 30 years. We've got some very interesting history in Batavia, which we're going to be able to share. And these signs will be up. They're going to be, some of them, the first 10 are going up here very soon, and then there'll be about another 10 made. And we will have used the $85,000, but Dunham tells me if you got more stories, let us know and we'll give you more money, because they think it's just really quite an interesting thing. So that kind of wraps me up today of what I wanted to tell you about books. And I guess I just suggest that we maybe should have a thing about movies, because we may be in the movies here on a couple of these stories that I told you. But that's it. Up here in the front, I brought some handouts. I've got some copies of the story of Streamer that was in the Jack and Joe magazine, if anybody would like to have that. I have a number of people tell me they've read it to their grandchildren today when they're putting them to bed, and everybody just loves that story. And I also brought some copies of the Saturday Evening Post cover with the ice skaters on it, because Bill Wood had me get him a unmarked copy of that magazine, so we can make as many copies of that as we want. And then the last thing is, if I'm invited back next year, I already got a book to report on, and this is a very well done book. This is the City of Batavia, Illinois, building the waterworks and sewer systems in the early years, 1898 to 1908. And John Dillon, who was our water superintendent, along with the cooperation of Bill Wood and a couple others, and again my secretaries helped get a lot of this stuff identified where it was. He's done this fabulous book. Now the problem he has with the book is it's very expensive to print this, because it's several hundred pages. So what I think I'm going to do, it's 229 pages, I'm going to have it scanned and we'll have it on the city, and I'll put it on the city's web page. I talked to John about this yesterday. He was agreeable to it, so that anybody that wants to see it should be able in the future to go on the computer and read this. And I will be talking about this, if I'm back next year, I will be talking about this book, because there's a lot of anecdotal things about Batavia in here that I think people will find very interesting. Kind of ironic, you know, you try to, the backstory, you talk about the past and maybe there's some connection. Well, in this one there is a connection, because when in 1893 we burned down the old East Side School, and there was an immediate need to build a new school, so they rebuilt it, and that was enough of an incentive for the community to pass a referendum to put in a water system, which did get put in 1893 to 1895. And guess what? That whole water system was done in iron. And so now you've got all these chips that are coming out, so we now have to go in and remove all the original pipes out of the system and put the new stuff in, and that you're beginning to see that around town. If you've been down on North Water Street or South Water Street the last few weeks, some of that's going on down there right now. But we just did Main Street 2 years ago. When we rebuilt Main Street, we took out all the pipes and put in the new stuff. So the old water system served us for well over 100 years, but it's apparently not really safe to drink the water out of it, so it's all being replaced. So onward and upward. So again, thank you, good to see you, I really appreciate the good sized crowd.